Hey, and welcome back to Miss Kitty's Wild West Adventures. I hope you brought your popcorn, Huckleberries, because today I have a story of kidnap, attempted murder, and one courageous badass woman. So buckle up. On March 31st, 1860, Hampton Brown, a cook at a woodcutter's camp in the southern Arizona Santa Rita Mountains, yes, Arizona does have mountains, spied what he thought was a ghost crawling toward him. The ghostly figure of a woman was wearing nothing more than a white chemise and a petticoat. Her skeletal frame was a patchwork of sunburn and broken skin. Her hair was matted, and she had a fine white powder and feathers stuck to her flesh. Suddenly, the ghost wheezed out,
"I am Larcena Page,"
and then promptly collapsed. Brown carried the woman to his camp, where his wife, Mary, washed the young woman, removed the stones and thorns that had penetrated her feet, and dressed her in clean clothes. The ghostly woman then asked for some tobacco and fell asleep. Meanwhile, a band of woodcutters set off for Tucson to retrieve the woman's husband, who had been mourning the loss of his pretty young wife. You see, 15 days earlier, Larcena had been at the woodcutters' camp, recovering from an illness we now call valley fever, when a band of Apaches had raided the camp and destroyed their meager belongings, including sacks of flour and Larcena's own feather bed, a fact that will come into play later on. The Apaches then kidnapped Larcena, along with a 10-year-old girl that Larcena was caring for by the name of Mercedes. But not before Larcena had seized a Colt revolver and attempted to fire on her attackers. Did I mention she was a badass? The Apaches, with spears in their captives' ribs, forced the two girls to march toward their homeland, but Larcena would not go easily. She and Mercedes began ripping their clothes and leaving scraps of material along the way so that they could be easily found. That is, until the Apaches discovered what they were doing, and with the stolen Colt, ordered Larcena to remove her dress and her shoes. As she stripped down to her chemise and petticoat, she must have taken in the view, for they were high up on a cliff. The valley stretched out beneath her. It was then that she was either pushed or lost her footing, for she fell down the cliff and tumbled over the rocks below. Soon, pain was coming from all sides as multiple lance thrusts pierced her body from all angles. She could hear Mercedes crying and the Apaches cheering as the warriors repeatedly struck her. Finally came a crushing blow to her skull, and she was cast into oblivion. The Apaches, one wearing her shoes, took off, still holding Mercedes as captive. Several hours later, as the sun was setting, Larcena regained consciousness. She heard her husband's voice crying out from the top of the cliff. Her small dog, who had been in the tent when she was kidnapped, had led the rescue party to the place of her abandonment, but her husband could not see her because of the setting sun. She was far too weak to call out. Then he spotted her shoe prints walking away from the cliff, for an Apache, remember, had put on her shoes on his own feet. John Page appealed to Captain Richard Ewell at Fort Buchanan for help in rescuing his wife and her young charge. Over the next few days, negotiations were initiated between Ewell and the Apaches who took the women. Sadly, they informed Ewell that Larcena had been killed, but they agreed to return Mercedes in exchange for the release of some Apache prisoners. That exchange went off without a hitch, and I will do another story about what happened to Mercedes later on. For now, let's return to Larcena. For several days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, she found snow and attempted to clean her wounds, but many of them were on her back and she could not reach them. She recognized land formations that she used as guideposts to slowly make her way back to the camp. It was far too difficult to climb back up to the top of the cliff, and she knew there might not be any water if she climbed too far down the hill. So she was forced to find a delicate balance somewhere between the top and the bottom of the mountain. She survived by eating berries, grasses, and wild onions, and melting snow for water. Barefoot, her feet quickly became infected by the open sores she incurred from pebbles and thorns. She soon found herself crawling simply to make progress. Once she found a nice patch of warm grass to lie down in, but quickly realized it was a bear den. For every 2 feet of forward progress, she would often slip 4 feet back and have to spend precious time regaining lost ground. Almost 2 weeks into her ordeal, when she had all but given up, she heard voices and saw 2 men off in the distance. She gathered up what strength she had and screamed for help, but the men were too far off to hear, and they walked the opposite way. While most of us would have felt defeated at this point, Larcena realized that the men looked like loggers, and therefore she must be near the camp. She climbed on for another day or 2, and soon found her very own tent, the same tent that the Apaches had raided some 15 days earlier. The flour and feathers were still strewn about, and she carefully separated the feathers from the flour, gathered water from a nearby stream, started a fire, cooked herself some flour cakes, and after she had had her fill, she laid down to rest. When she woke up, she went to find help, and it was then that she came across Hampton Brown. After the loggers retrieved her husband, he summoned Dr. C.B. Hughes to tend to his wife. But the doctor said, "Subscribe to Miss Kitty's Wild West Adventures." But the doctor told John that there was no hope to save Larcena. But John would hear none of that. He took her to Tucson, where she was under the constant care of a doctor, and after several weeks of touch and go, Larcena began to improve. Later that summer, Larcena was fully recovered, physically at least, and returned to the lumber camp with her husband. Sadly, this is not the end of Larcena's troubles. In February of the next year, John took an extra job, escorting supply wagons through the treacherous Apache lands. Larcena and John needed the extra money, as Larcena was pregnant with their first child. On February 20th, when John's party stopped to water their horses, they were ambushed by Apaches. John ultimately died from his wounds. In September, Larcena gave birth to a daughter she named Mary. In August of 1870, Larcena married a lawyer and judge by the name of William Fisher Scott. She went on to live a quiet life in and around Tucson, Arizona. She died at the age of 76 and is buried in Evergreen Memorial Park in Tucson. Her tombstone bears the inscription, "A Pioneer," but I think we all agree a more appropriate inscription would be "A Badass." Have you ever heard the story of Larcena Pennington Page? Perhaps you've been on Pennington Street in Tucson, Arizona, named for her family. If so, please leave a comment down below. For those of you who know about Old West history, flour cakes settle a debate. Are they tortillas or are they fry bread? Let me know down in the comments below. What do you think? We hope you enjoyed this episode of Miss Kitty's Wild West Adventures. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell for notifications. In the meantime, I'll catch you on down the trail.